In this video, we're going to take a look at floor tiles, which are another type of hard flooring. Floor tiles date back to very early in our history, and most of us know that the Romans used them. They were very popular choices of flooring material, so they have literally been around for centuries. There are many different types of floor tiles. Some of them are man-made and some of them are natural stone. I'm going to make some separate short videos to go over the different types of floor tiles and the advantages and disadvantages of each. What I want to go over here are the general pros and cons, and also important things to consider regardless of what type of floor tile you use. Let's start by looking at some of the advantages of floor tiles. First of all, they're usually quite a practical choice. Because they're a hard flooring, they're durable and they will be long-lasting under foot traffic. Many choices clean easily and don't stain easily. We'll cover that in a little bit more detail as we go on to the different types. Again, most of them are waterproof or at least water resistant. And they're also pretty resistant to fire, so they stop the spread of fire. Of course, they have a few disadvantages, so let's look at them. The first one is they can be hard to stand on for long periods of time, but this isn't generally a problem when you're talking about interior design for the home. Another disadvantage is that they can be cold underfoot, but floor tiles are really the perfect flooring to use with underfloor heating. So that's a really easy way to get around this. They can be expensive. Even sometimes you can get really good deals on floor tiles, but of course then you have to pay to install them. And if you use intricate patterns or anything that's a little bit out of the ordinary, that will up the price. Finally, they're often viewed as a permanent floor finish. Once you put them down, they're really something that you don't want to take up again. I actually think this is more of an advantage than a disadvantage, but it does mean that you have to make your choices carefully. Okay, so here's an example of a black and white marble tiled floor. I think you can agree that this is really timeless and elegant. Even if it's a permanent feature, it's not something that's going to date. I've got another image here of flooring that's really quite similar, almost identical, but you can actually see at the edges here they have this border tile going around. It just adds additional interest. And also notice the direction of the pattern. Here the tile is actually laid on a diagonal pattern, whereas here it's laid in a straightforward grid pattern. They're both very timeless and elegant designs, and the reason I chose both of these images is just to illustrate that even small details can make a difference, so it's really vital that you plan from the outset. So what are the main things that you need to think about when you're choosing floor tiles? Let's take a look. First of all, the pattern. You can see here that these tiles are laid in a herringbone pattern. But the tiles themselves are actually plain floor tiles. It's just the way that they've been laid to create this pattern. Obviously, a completely different effect would be created if they were laid straight in a standard grid fashion. So patterns can be achieved in a number of ways. Sometimes you'll actually create the pattern yourself, like in this example, simply by the way that you lay the tiles. Other times you'll actually buy tiles that are sold in different sizes to create a pattern when they're laid. When you're getting tiles like these, you'll need to make sure that you get the correct quantities of each size of tile. The supplier will usually provide very clear guidelines, and more often than not they'll also give you a visual guide that you can give to your tiler. Another thing I want you to notice here is the edges. If you look at the edges of these tiles, they're slightly uneven and they create that kind of rustic feel. Now, let's look at another example here. And again, these are a very similar pattern to the one on the left. And again, different tones in these tiles, the same way that these have different tones, but they're a completely different effect because of the straight edge there. It's much more contemporary and streamlined. And just in case you think the color's throwing you off, here's another example where I've got a similar color floor, and again the tiles here are more uniform in shape, but look at the difference once again just because we have these rough edges here. It's a more natural and rustic feel. More often than not, the size of the floor tiles that you use will also be relevant to this type of space that you're designing. But even this is only a guideline. It can be really fun to mix them up. Like here you see a smaller tile around the perimeter of the room, and in the center there's this larger tile. Generally speaking, large format tiles are best used on large areas. The size and scale can look wrong if you put them into a small area, but also there'll be a lot of wastage where you're cutting tiles to fit into various corners and around edges. And when you're using large format tiles, that can result in a higher cost. When you're tiling large areas, it can be really nice to mix and match different sizes of tiles and also different colors, because it just adds visual interest. So if you can see here on the left, we've got a larger tile here around the perimeter, and in the center, the smaller tile with a border. Again, here on the right, we have a large format tile, but it's broken up just by using these additional trims. One of the things that can work really well with the tiled floor is just adding a border. Again, this is so easy to do because you're working with all individual pieces. It's a very simple way to add a touch of elegance and class. You can even take this one step further if you want to, like in this example, where the central part of the flooring actually frames where the bath is, and it really makes a statement about the whole thing. Plus, it ties everything in together very nicely. Here's another example where a similar effect has been achieved in a kitchen. Here again, they've added a border around the kitchen island, and then there's a border around the perimeter of the room. It just breaks up the monotony of the floor, and again, it adds visual interest and really gives structure to the whole design. The good thing about a border is you can make it in any size that you want to, and any shape, of course. So it's a really nice way of adding a detail in a small area. You can very easily achieve visual interest without overkill. One of the beauties of this approach is that you have so much control over the final design. In this example here, you can see they've used a mosaic tile and they've used it three tiles thick. But again, you can determine exactly how many you want. You could have just chosen 2, or you could have just chosen 1. In fact, in this example, my personal choice would probably be just 1 tile thick, because I think it would be a little bit more elegant. But again, that's just personal preference. Here's another example, and again you can see they've actually got 2 lines, so they've got 2 borders. One is slightly thicker than the other. There's so many ways that you can actually add variety. These tiles look very similar both in the size and in the finish, so they're probably from the same range of tiles, but you don't have to stick to that. You can actually mix in something completely different, and it's a really good way of making an inexpensive tile look a little bit more expensive. You can achieve a really lovely effect by just adding a mosaic tile in marble with a standard floor tile. It can just really change the whole impact of the floor. It's also possible to mix flooring materials. In the past, when you would have mixed flooring materials like hardwood and tiles, it was a little bit more difficult to achieve because the materials are different thicknesses, they don't always sit so well together, and it does take a contractor who has time and patience. In the last few years, these timber effect tiles have become very popular, and they're available in both ceramic and porcelain varieties, so it makes it really easy to do something like this. Here's a couple more examples. In this example here on the left, you can actually see this is a very simple geometric pattern, just with a square mosaic tile border. On the right here, we actually have a really small, subtle detail. Again, just this little petal design. And again, it's just very simply just changing a few tiles to make something like this. And it just adds lovely interest without overkill. Okay, most of the borders that we've looked at so far are actually around the perimeter or around the edge of a room, but you can also just invert that, and in fact you can actually just choose a tile, a contrasting tile to put in the center of the room, and it has an effect like creating a small area type rug. Again, it creates visual interest and it provides a focus point for the flooring. The contrast you choose doesn't need to be dramatic either. You can actually have a very successful design just by creating a change of texture. You don't need to have a dramatic color contrast. This image here on the right isn't a particularly good quality image, but I picked it because I just wanted to show you. Look here, you've got an identical color tile, but again, just this change of texture here at the side just really adds that visual interest. Okay, so a couple of things that you need to take into consideration when you're doing a border is actually how it is going to progress around the room. If you're actually going to take in the shape and go around to the actual perimeter and follow the lines around the room. If you want to do something like this, you also need to give very clear instructions to your tiler. The reason I brought up these 2 images here is because they're obviously a very similar color and pattern, but also notice the way they're finished. If you look on the left-hand side, this border is inset correctly and it follows the line of the room. If you look here on the right hand side, here the border actually ends in line with the bath. Now, in my opinion, this is actually a mistake, and ideally this should actually follow around and go into the wall here beside the bath. The reason I wanted to show you this is because if you want something, you have to specify it. You have to give very clear and accurate instructions. If you just say, I'm looking for a border to go around the room, the tiler themselves might think, well, this is a very natural place just to end this here so that it's in line with the bath. But honestly, it looks wrong. So without having clear instructions from you, they're just going to go ahead and do what they think is best. And in their mind, this may make perfect sense. Once the tiles begin to set, then it's really hard to make a change. So again, you just really need to consider all of these things from the outset. Another point to remember when you are deciding on borders is, will these structures be here permanently? So in this example here, this is just a portion of a kitchen floor, and you can see that this border tile actually goes around this area of the kitchen unit. As we said already, floor tiles are generally seen as a more permanent feature. Once they're down, you don't really want to have to take them up. But the thing is, your kitchen may be redesigned in years to come, whereas you may have a projection now that may not be there in the future. And again, you're limiting yourself by doing something like this. Now, there's no right or wrong. This could be a really nice detail, but these are things that you just need to take into account from the very beginning. What really ties into this as well is where your flooring should actually end. Generally speaking, you should have everything removed from the room before you actually lay your floor tiles, so that you can go completely from wall to wall. But that's not always possible. Sometimes, for example, you might have a kitchen already installed and you don't want to take everything out. In a design project, I would always make sure that I lay the flooring first before I put in any built-in or custom units. Some people actually see this as a waste because obviously you're paying to lay tiles in an area that you're not actually going to see. But my own personal preference is always just to go wall to wall because it allows for maximum flexibility in the future. Another thing to think about with floor tiles is where they join against the wall. How are you going to actually handle that join to make sure that it's attractively finished off? If you have a traditional wooden molding skirting board or baseboard, I would generally advise to actually remove it and then put on a new one or just reinstall the same one after the floor tiles have been laid. They really are relatively inexpensive and the finish makes a big difference. If you want to reuse the existing skirting or baseboard, just take into account that you may need to make some small notches because the floor level will actually be raised from before and certain pieces may have to be cut out in order for it to fit back in. This is really a small detail. It's something relatively minor and not something that you need to worry about. But the reason I mention it is sometimes you may get a tiler who says, oh, I don't do carpentry. So it's just something that you need to be aware of and possibly take into account. Another thing to think about is how the wall finish will be. If you are tiling in a bathroom in particular, you may use wall tiles as well. And you can't actually fit the baseboard or the skirting board on top of the actual wall tiles. So the best thing to do to get a really neat finish is to actually have the floor laid first, then have the skirting board put on, and then actually have the wall tiles put into place. When it's finished off with grout and caulking, it will look perfect. Here's just another little example where maybe the tiles possibly went in after the wall finish was already in place. It can be very hard to get perfectly straight lines across a number of tiles when they're all lining up, particularly when you're working with small tiles like this. So the thing is, it will draw attention to the eye. So it's better off to actually put some type of small molding on top and then just paint that the same color as the skirting board. When we were talking about wooden flooring, I said that I didn't really particularly like this, but it looks better when it comes to tiles. Some of these things seem like real small, fussy details, but when you make the wrong choice, it can really spoil the effect of your flooring. In this example here, they've used a wooden molding and it's contrasting to the actual floor. Personally, I think it really attracts the eye and I just don't think it's a very attractive finish. What I probably would have done myself here would be to use a half tile maybe as a skirting board. Some tiling manufacturers also produce different profiles specifically for this purpose. In this particular example, they've used a marble profile here that's a very similar color to the floor. But as I said, sometimes you can actually buy something that will be identical to the floor within the same range. This finishing detail is just another way to really personalize your design. So if you look here, there's a contrasting tile that's been used. Obviously, we've just got a very strict color scheme of black and white. But again, it just adds visual interest and it's something that's unique. Let's take a look at just a couple more examples. Here you actually see really a very plain floor tile and just the detail has been actually put in the skirting board here. And again here, this is a terracotta tile, floor tile, laid in a brick effect pattern. And they have this really lovely Mediterranean detail here at the side. And once again, it's not just the color of the terracotta that ties in, but this blue is actually tied in with just a very simple border around the outset. Another thing that you can do is just actually continue the floor tile straight up. Now we did look at an example there of just a plain floor tile, but here's another one with just a mosaic. And if we look here in this example on the right, you can see a completely different effect here. They've used a border on the floor tile, but that has actually continued up onto the wall. There are so many different things you can do with floor tiles. Really, your imagination is the only limit. I'm going to stick with this theme just a little bit and just show you two more examples of this type of effect where the floor tile has actually been carried up onto the wall. One thing to take into account here is that you can use floor tiles on walls, but not the other way around. More often than not, your wall tiles will be much thinner than the actual floor tiles. So this is something that you have to also consider when you're putting it beside a different type of tile on the wall. In the example here on the left, you can actually see there's a whole wall area which is covered in these tiles, so that's not a problem. But here on the right, if you're trying to match it in with a wall tile of a different thickness, that can be a problem. Now, some manufacturers produce their tiles in both floor and wall tile variations, so you could very easily do that without any difficulty. But again, it just may be a factor, and you may need to actually, if you're going to use floor tiles on the wall, you may need to put them over a whole area rather than just a small area like this. While I have these examples up here, let's just talk about pattern. If you are using a random pattern like this example here on the right, you need to really specify again, even lay out the tiles ahead of time. Don't leave it to your contractor to decide where they should go. The example on the left is obviously a uniform pattern, so that's not going to be a problem, but you still may want to specify exactly where it should start and finish. The example on the right, though, could really go wrong if the tiles are put in the wrong places. Just want to show you a similar example, and here on the left, again, they haven't used the tile, this colored tile, all over the place. They've just put a few random segments in. In my opinion, it's a little bit disjointed. It doesn't have really a flow. And this is another example I wanted to look at on the right here, where they've still used this kind of patchwork effect, but again, they've actually used 4 tiles grouped together for each section rather than just matching individual tiles. And again, it just, still has all of that visual variety, but it just has a little bit more structures to it. This could be just as nice if you just mixed and match all individual tiles, but I have to say I do like the effect of this. Couple of other things to think about is that when you're using something that's very patterned, be careful about having too many different components. So in these examples here, they've got not just patterns but different colors as well. So you may tire of them, you may get bored, and they may actually date. If you compare those colored varieties here with the black and white, I think you can see that you've still got a lot of visual interest, but this would be a lot more timeless. My own thinking when it comes to flooring is that it should be something that's really elegant and that will last for years and years. This is turning out to be quite a long video, but we're almost there. Just another thing that I really wanted to show you is just this unusual detail of using tiles on the upright section of stairs. I think it's really effective, and it's just a great way to add, again, that interest and personal individuality and character. Now, 2 things about this. First of all, you do have color, but again, you just have 2 colors. You have the blue and white. So it's not overkill. You're not going to get tired of it so much. But also look at the difference between the left and the right. The scale and size of the actual pattern itself makes a big difference. Of course, we go into pattern completely in a different lesson, but these are just things that you need to weigh up all of the different components of your design. Think carefully before you start using really contemporary materials as well, because again, they can be something that can look dated very quickly. So this type of finish here, the white tile is fairly straightforward. There's nothing about that is going to date too quickly. But this small kind of glass mosaic is something that's really quite in trend at the moment, and it may be something that just looks dated in another 5 or possibly 10 years. If you look at the one on the left versus the one on the right, we've still got a mix of materials here, but because this is more subdued and more muted, again, I think this is something that is a bit more timeless. It's not going to date half as quickly as the example on the left. Okay, so when you do actually make your choices about floor tiles, another thing to just consider is the actual size of the joints and the space that you allow for grouting. Look here again, these are very tightly fitted together here on the left, whereas the spacing here gives a completely different effect. I know they're different sizes of tile, but I think you can get my meaning. Here's another example where the tiles on the left are very tightly fitted together, and again you can see there is more spacing between them here on the right. The effect here really on the left hand side is that it looks more like a type of sheet flooring. Again, there's no right or wrong here. It depends on personal preference and what suits the particular style and characteristics of the flooring that you've chosen. The colour of the grouting is another thing that you really need to consider carefully. More often than not, I would usually recommend that the grouting colour actually matches the floor tiles, but that's not always possible. And sometimes you may want to deliberately contrast for effect. If you're using different colours of floor tiles, you may want to match the grout across the different colours. Obviously, so if you've got a paler colour, match that, and obviously match the darker colour if you are using combining 2 colours together. Many tilers and salespeople will actually tell you that you should go with a dark grout colour because otherwise it will become dirty. But honestly, it can change the whole appearance of the floor, and I generally wouldn't recommend it unless it's an effect that you particularly want to achieve. Tiles, as I said, are pretty much a lifetime job, but grouting does require some maintenance. Here's an example of a tiled floor before and after it was cleaned. There are products available now to seal the grout, and that will protect the colour and the cleanliness. But you can also buy these colorants. So if you actually have a tiled floor that you don't like the particular colour of the grout, you can actually go over it with some of these colorants. So these are things that you should be aware of, look at, and they'll all form part of your design process. So we've covered a lot in this video, and we haven't even looked at the different types of floor tile. So before we do that, let's just summarize what we've looked at so far. Again, these are the things that you really need to consider, and you can use this as a kind of checklist. First of all, the size of the tiles and how they relate to the overall scale of the room. Secondly, patterns, and whether you introduce a pattern by simply the way that you actually lay the floor tiles or whether you use a pattern floor tile. Again, borders, and whether you want to inset them, use them right at the edge, all the different varieties that come with that. The joint with the wall, again we talked about either the skirting or the baseboard or using a tile. The joint width, which is the distance between the actual tiles themselves. The grout colour, and also using grout sealant to preserve the colour and make it more durable and long lasting. Okay, you may want to take a little breather now and digest all of that information, and when you're ready you'll find videos below here that go into a bit more detail about the various different types of floor tiles.